The linking expression on the one hand, on the other hand, may sometimes be used incorrectly, so we're going to see how to use it accurately. You can use both on the one hand and then on the other hand to introduce two different elements. You always need to use the second part, you always need to say on the other hand, but the first element may be omitted. But the important thing for you to remember is that there needs to be a contrast. So, for example, you may need to be talking about two completely different elements, or perhaps about something positive and then about something negative, or the other way around, something negative and then something positive. But there needs to be a contrast. You use this to indicate that there is a difference between the two elements mentioned or the two situations mentioned. So it is typically used to introduce perhaps pros and cons, although not exclusively, but in any case, two different elements. Perhaps one of the images for you to remember is the idea of a balance, where you weigh the pros and cons, or you see alternatives, different elements. But as I'm saying all the time, you're going to establish a contrast. So you may mention or you may decide to omit the first element, but just for you to know, if you wanted to use on the other hand, synonym words could be examples such as however, nevertheless. And sometimes this is introduced with a but on the other hand. Okay? That's not necessary at all, but sometimes if you use it in the same sentence, it can be introduced with this. So, now that you know that on the other hand is used to introduce two different elements, two different or even opposing arguments, for example, have a look at this sentence. In your view, is this correct? If you have a look at this sentence, you will notice that both arguments are actually positive arguments, arguments in favor of driving. So, because both are pros, imagine if you were using these building blocks, you would be adding more arguments in favor. Okay? They would be somehow on the same side of the argument. Okay? That is why in this context you cannot use on the other hand. If you want to add more information, if you want to add further arguments on the same side of the argument, what you can use is something like, for example, moreover, besides, what's more, on top of that. Any of those linking words or similar ones could be okay, but you cannot use on the other hand because you are not establishing a contrast. Have a look at this sentence now. In your view, is this correct or wrong? As opposed to the previous example, the first argument is something positive in favor of driving. However, the second argument is a downside, is a con, is something negative. In this context, as we said before, this is the right time to use on the other hand. To say something positive, driving a car may be convenient. However, on the other hand, it may be quite difficult to find a parking space sometimes. If you used a very simple linking word, you would say, driving a car may be convenient, but it may be difficult. These are just some more examples of weighing the pros and cons of a situation, having a look at both sides of the argument. Studying abroad can be exciting. On the other hand, it can also be challenging and stressful, positive than negative. Another example where a contrast is established. Working from home can provide a better work-life balance, but on the other hand, however, it can blur the line between work and personal life. In this case, there is no positive or negative. This is simply comparing and contrasting two different elements, the city and the countryside. So you're weighing the pros and cons of each. I love the convenience of living in the city. On the other hand, however, I do miss the peace and quiet of the countryside. So remember, if you are Spanish speakers, you may think that the word por otra parte can be translated as on the other hand. Not always. Whenever you are adding information, in Spanish we might use that expression, not in English. If you are adding arguments on the same side of the argument, in this case, you would have to use something like moreover, what's more, besides, on top of that, any of those linking words that help you add information, as if you were adding blocks. And something similar happens here. You have this positive argument and you have another positive argument. So the plan is cost effective, besides, moreover, furthermore, what's more. Together with that, any of those can be used here. But you can't use on the other hand if you are adding information, not establishing a contrast.